He refused every medic. Then the night nurse whispered Raven 6's dead code, and a trauma room full of blood alarms and shouted orders went silent. Maybe you know that feeling in another form. Your body is here, but your mind is still trapped somewhere it never escaped. A bright hallway feels like an interrogation light. A hand reaching to help feels like a threat. On a rain-soaked night in Tacoma, one wounded soldier came through the ER carrying more than bullets in his body. He carried betrayal memory and the kind of fear that turns every stranger into danger. This is not just a hospital story. It is a story about trauma, hidden loyalty, buried truth, and what happens when the one person nobody noticed is the only one who understands. Stay with me to the end then, like, comment, and tell me where you're watching from. To understand why 6 dead words could stop a bleeding soldier in the middle of a trauma room, you have to start with the life Mara Bennett had spent years teaching the world to misread. At Harbor Ridge Regional Trauma Center in Tacoma, she was known for the kinds of things hospitals praise without ever quite respecting enough. She was dependable. She was calm. She did not complain when the board turned ugly at 2 in the morning, and half the department looked ready to catch fire. She came in on time, stayed late when the handoffs went bad, and took the rooms other people avoided with the same quiet face she wore for everything else. Not blank, not cold, just settled. Like she had made peace with the fact that fear would always arrive faster than help, and somebody still had to be steady when it did. She worked nights because nights stripped people down to the truth. That was what she told herself, at least. It was not that nights were quieter. Anyone who had ever spent time in an emergency department after midnight knew better than that. There was no quiet, not real quiet. There was only a different kind of noise. The fluorescent hum seemed louder when the waiting room thinned. Wheel locks clicked harder on tile. Printers spat labels into the blue-white glow of the station. The phones rang less often, but every call sounded more urgent. Less theater, less posture, more raw need. In the day, pain still wore makeup. At night, it stopped pretending. Mara liked that. She liked the old man who came in swearing his chest pressure was indigestion while his hand trembled on the rail. She liked the college kid with glitter still clinging to one eyelash after a bad party and a worse decision too ashamed to look anyone in the eye. She liked the woman in alcohol withdrawal who cursed like a dock worker until the nausea hit and left her crying into a hospital blanket she kept apologizing for ruining. She liked the combat veteran who would let every nurse in the building examine him except the ones who lied when he asked if it would hurt. Mara never lied about pain. She believed people could survive a great deal if you gave it a shape they could hold. This will sting for 10 seconds. You are going to feel pressure before you feel relief. Look at the vent above me, not at the needle. I am about to touch your arm. You can be angry and still let me help you. It was not sweetness that made frightened people listen to her. Sweetness breaks easily in rooms built like battlefields. What Mara had was steadiness. She did not rush to match panic. She did not pile empty reassurance on top of somebody else's terror and call that compassion. She gave smaller truths and people trusted those more. Her voice never begged a room to calm down. It gave the room something more useful to do. The younger nurses admired her from a careful distance. The older ones leaned on her in the silent ways experience teaches. If a patient was combative in the kind of way a chart could never really capture, not violent exactly, but trapped, unreachable, brittle with fear, and halfway gone from the body, lying in the bed, Mara was the nurse they called. No one could have explained exactly how she did it. She had a way of standing that left people room. A way of watching that felt less like surveillance than readiness. A way of moving through a room that made every object look chosen. Dr. Sophie Lane, one of the newer emergency medicine residents, had started noticing that before anyone else her age did. Sophie was smart in the hungry way of people who still thought enough effort could make medicine fair. She worked hard, asked real questions, and had not yet learned the institutional trick of pretending not to see what made senior people uncomfortable. She liked Mara because Mara never treated her like a child just because she was still learning. She corrected her without humiliating her. She expected precision. She did not waste words. Sophie found that strangely comforting. Dr. Ethan Cole was different. Cole was exactly the sort of physician a trauma center likes to imagine at the center of itself. Tall, composed, sharp jaw, expensive watch, white coat, clean even at the end of a bloody shift. He was gifted under pressure. He could open a chest bark, 3 orders, and still have enough attention left to catch a dropping pressure before the monitor started screaming. Residents straightened when he entered a room. Medical students practically inhaled every sentence that came out of his mouth. He was not cruel. Cruelty would have made him easier to dismiss. He simply had the dangerous confidence of a man who had spent enough years being right that he had started confusing rank with vision. When someone spoke from below him in the food chain, his first instinct was often to hear interruption before information. He respected good nurses in the abstract. He depended on them in practice. But dependency is not the same thing as understanding. Somewhere deep in his bones, he still imagined leadership as the loudest voice nearest the center of the room. Mara knew that about him. So did everyone else. She never seemed bothered by it, and that unsettled people more than anger would have. One early spring night, Harbor Ridge got slammed after a pileup on Interstate 5 during a cold rain. Tail lights folded into each other across 6 lanes. By the time the first ambulance doors opened, the trauma rooms were already filling. They got scalp lacerations, fractured wrists, a child with a seatbelt bruise across his chest, an exhausted mother with blood on both sleeves that did not turn out to be hers, and a teenage boy who walked in upright and talking but whose pupils seemed just a fraction too slow. Cole moved through the department the way he always did, in a surge, quick, decisive, already 3 steps ahead. The teenager was flagged for imaging after a rapid stabilization pass. Someone had wrapped the obvious head wound. The chart looked clean enough for the moment. Cole moved on. Mara was hanging a fresh pressure bag in the next bay when something pulled her attention sideways. Not a shout, not blood, something smaller. The boy had gone strangely still. His head had tipped just enough to show the skin behind his ear. There, at the hairline, was a thin line of red slipping somewhere it should not have been slipping. Barely visible. Easy to miss. Mara crossed the room, leaned in, and looked harder. Swelling was already building behind the ear. She straightened. "I need micro-sutures and the vascular tray in here right now." One of the interns looked up from the computer and almost asked why. Mara met his eyes before the question formed. Whatever he saw in her face was enough. He moved. Cole came back irritated, then stopped being irritated the second the wound opened under better light and revealed what she had seen. Not dramatic on the surface, but dangerous in exactly the kind of way that kills people, while everyone is still congratulating themselves for staying on schedule. They caught it in time. The boy lived. By morning, the official debrief praised rapid physician intervention under mass casualty conditions. Cole accepted the thanks with the exhausted professionalism of a man used to being thanked. Mara sat in the back of the room, correcting medication timestamps from the night before. Later, one of the senior nurses found her restocking gauze in the supply room. "Does it ever get to you?" Mara kept lining the packs on the shelf. "What? People taking credit for what you catch." She did not answer at once. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. Someone laughed too loudly down the hall. The hospital smelled like hand soap, bleach, and stale coffee. "When he leaves here," Mara said at last, "he will not care who noticed first." The nurse watched her for a moment. "That is not normal." Mara almost smiled. "Neither is this place." That was the thing about her. People kept trying to locate ambition in her and failing. They mistook the absence of self-advertisement for the absence of force. The truth was stranger than that. Mara had once lived in a world where recognition arrived, wrapped in smoke, static blood loss, and body counts. Hospital praise felt weightless by comparison. It fluttered. It landed nowhere. She preferred hard outcomes. An airway stayed open, or it did not. A bleed was found, or it was not. A patient made it to morning, or did not. There was comfort in that, the clean edge of it. The body is honest in ways institutions never are. Still, now and then, traces of something older showed through. Mara never sat with her back to a break room door. When local news footage showed war zones or convoy strikes on the mounted television over the vending machine she left before the anchors started talking. It was not political discomfort. It was more physical than that. The skin at the back of her neck would go tight. Her shoulders would settle into a stillness that looked calm until you understood what it cost. The hospital sat beneath the path of military aircraft moving in and out of Joint Base Lewis McChord. Most staff barely registered the helicopters after a while. Rotor wash became part of the city, another layer of Tacoma weather. Mara always noticed. It would happen in an instant. One beat of stillness. One breath held a fraction too long. Her hand flattening against a counter or a medication cart until the sound passed on. Sophie saw it once after a chest tube placement. They were cleaning up in Trauma 3. The patient had gone upstairs. The room still smelled faintly of iron and sterile drapes. A helicopter crossed low enough outside to make the high windows hum. Sophie looked up. "You okay?" Mara kept folding a used towel into neat quarters. "Fine." Sophie hesitated. "You react to that sound. Most people do. Not like that." Mara set the towel down. Some sounds get wired in. Sophie waited, sensing there was more behind the sentence and smart enough not to force it. Mara appreciated that. A minute later, she handed Sophie a new pair of gloves and talked her through a medication check as if the conversation had never happened. There were marks, too, if anyone had looked close enough to notice. A pale line hidden near the base of her neck, usually covered by the fall of her hair. Another faint scar along one forearm that looked like old metal or old glass. She moved through the emergency department with a balance that had very little to do with grace and everything to do with practiced awareness. Her eyes skimmed reflections exits hands. She noticed who watched doors and who watched faces. She knew the difference between rage and panic before either one found language. No one at Harbor Ridge knew where she had learned that. They assumed, when they thought about it at all, that life had simply been hard on her in ways no one had asked about. That suited Mara. If anyone had followed her home after shift change, they would have found a life nearly as spare as her locker. She rented a one-bedroom apartment in a worn brick building above a dry cleaner on the edge of downtown Tacoma. The walls were plain except for one framed photograph of water at dawn. Her kitchen was clean to the point of discipline. Coffee, eggs, rice, tea, a few vegetables. Protein stacked in the freezer. A good knife. Nothing decorative that could not survive being ignored. There were no family photos in the living room. No evidence of a partner. No clutter that invited questions. She slept in short, efficient blocks and woke before her alarm more often than not. On mornings, when the adrenaline would not leave her system, she drove out before sunrise and walked the edge of Point Defiance while the sound held the first cold light of morning. The ferry horns sounded far off. Gulls moved in ragged circles over black water. The city had not yet fully remembered itself. Those were the hours she liked best. Nothing had started asking anything of her yet, and even there alone under wet branches with the air sharp in her lungs, she never fully stopped scanning. She noticed parked vehicles, blind turns in the trail, sightlines, the way someone behind her changed pace when she changed hers. It was exhausting to live that way. It was more exhausting to stop. There were nights when sleep came apart in fragments. She would wake with her pulse already racing, the sheet twisted around one leg, the taste of metal in her mouth. The images were never kind enough to form a whole scene, more like pieces. Mud, static in one ear, somebody shouting coordinates, somebody not answering. A flashlight beam cutting across torn canvas. Rotor wash. Blood on a glove that was not hers until it was. On those nights, she made tea, stood by the window until the apartment felt like an apartment again, and then went back to work. Harbor Ridge did not know it had become her compromise with the past. The hospital gave her structure without silence. Mission without uniform. People she could save one at a time instead of losing all at once. The lights were harsh. The coffee was terrible. The politics were predictable. But the work was honest enough for her to stay. Patients kept coming as they always did. The city fed them in by ambulance, by private car, by police escort, by friends carrying guilt in their faces. There was the unhoused man with infected feet who cursed out 2 technicians before anyone got near his boots. One of the techs muttered something about non-compliance under his breath and reached for trauma shears anyway. Mara crouched beside the bed, ignoring the smell that had already cleared half the room. "What do you need before we touch them?" The man stared at her with the suspicion of someone who had learned that every question hides an agenda. "Nothing. That is not true." His jaw moved. He looked tired enough to be made of dust. "I need you not to cut anything until you tell me first." Mara nodded once. "Done." He let her take the boots off. There was the woman detoxing from opioids who tried to bite a nurse during a blood draw and then dissolved into violent sobbing so hard she could not breathe through them. Mara dimmed the light, moved the emesis bag before the retching started, and sat where the woman could see her without feeling cornered. "You don't have to be polite to me," Mara said when the apologies began. "You just have to stay here." There was an aging infantry veteran with psychosis who refused every male staff member and screamed whenever security moved near the curtain. Mara noticed the pattern before anyone else did. His panic spiked whenever footsteps approached from his blind side. She changed the approach path, lowered voices, had people announce themselves from where he could see them. The restraints stayed unused. These things mattered. They mattered deeply to patients. Yet, in a system obsessed with speed hierarchy and visible heroics, that kind of skill often passed almost unnoticed because it looked too much like patience. One night, while reviewing a difficult sedation case, Cole said within easy hearing of half the station, Mara has good instincts with fragile personalities. Not everyone is built for trauma command. A few residents nodded like he had said something measured and fair. Sophie looked uncomfortable. Mara scanned a medication barcode and kept scanning. Later, Sophie found her in a charting alcove and blurted out, "For what it is worth, I think he is wrong." Mara clicked through an order set. "About what?" "About you." Mara closed the chart window. "That narrows it down very little." Sophie folded her arms. "When a room gets loud, you are the only person in it who never speeds up in the wrong direction." That almost pulled a real smile out of Mara. "Speed is not the trick," she said. "Sequence is." Sophie frowned, thinking. "That sounds like something you learned somewhere specific." Mara slid the workstation back into place. "Most useful things are." She left it there. Sophie let it rest, but the sentence stayed with her. The emergency department moved through late spring and into summer the way trauma centers always do, one crisis folding into the next, until ordinary people start mistaking endurance for normalcy. Children split their foreheads on kitchen counters. Construction workers came in with crushed fingers and pride bigger than their pain tolerance. Tourists got drunk near the waterfront and discovered concrete had opinions. Grandmothers arrived pale and breathless after minimizing symptoms for 3 days because they did not want to be a bother. Mara stitched herself into that rhythm so completely that people stopped imagining she had come from anywhere else. Then, on a wet Thursday night in October, the weather rolled in heavy off Puget Sound. Rain needled the high windows. The roads shone black beneath the parking lot lights. Harbor Ridge was busy without being overwhelmed, the kind of night staff almost trusted. A child with croup had finally fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder. An intoxicated mariner's fan was snoring under a heated blanket in observation. A man with chest pain was waiting on repeat labs and pretending he was not frightened. In Trauma 4. Sophie was reducing a shoulder dislocation on a college wrestler who kept insisting he could finish the season if they just wrapped it tight enough. Mara liked nights held at that temperature. Enough motion to keep everyone sharp. Not enough catastrophe to flatten the whole board. She helped the wrestler sit up, checked capillary refill, and made him repeat back the warning signs he was not allowed to ignore after discharge. When she stepped into the hall, Sophie caught up with her carrying a chart. "You ever think about advanced practice?" Mara glanced over. Terrifyingly random question. "I mean it." Sophie smiled. "You would be good. Maybe better than good." Mara took the chart and flipped through the vitals. Terrifyingly good is not the target outcome. You know what I mean. You see things before other people do. That is experience. That is more than experience. Mara opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer she was willing to give that would satisfy the curiosity under Sophie's voice without opening doors she had worked hard to keep shut. At the nurse's station, Cole was reviewing imaging with another attending while the unit secretary fielded calls from upstairs. Monitors glowed. Sticker printers rattled. Someone down the hall laughed softly at something stupid and tired. For one brief ordinary minute, the department felt like a machine running exactly as designed. Then the radio on the charge desk cracked to life. Everyone looked up. Inbound trauma dispatch said through static. Adult male, approximately 32 to 35, penetrating trauma to shoulder and left flank. Significant blood loss. Patient found near disabled government tactical vehicle off a service road outside Tacoma. Severe agitation. Possible military affiliation. ETA 6 minutes. The room changed pressure. Not dramatically, just enough for instinct to sharpen. Cole was already reaching for the trauma board. Trauma 2, full activation. The secretary began relaying pages. Respiratory rolled equipment into place. Sophie headed for supply. Security moved toward the bay doors. Mara did not move right away. Disabled tactical vehicle. Possible military affiliation. Severe agitation. Then dispatch came back on voice thinner now, as if the person at the other end knew more than they liked. Additional note. Patient repeatedly states he was sold out. Law enforcement reports possible weapons involvement at scene. Unclear whether active pursuit remains ongoing. The phrase hit her with the precision of a blade. Sold out. Not attacked. Not ambushed. Sold out. Mara felt the smallest change in her own breathing. Cole was assigning roles. Lane with me. Respiratory in room. Security outside until we know what we have. Bennett, prep blood and have restraint backup ready if he escalates. Mara looked at him. He saw only a nurse being given a task. She saw the shape of the night turning. Understood, she said. She crossed into Trauma 2 and began laying out equipment with the same efficient calm she had used 1,000 times before. Suction checked, dressings ready. Suture packs opened but untouched. Saline hung. Monitor leads sorted. She moved in clean lines, each motion economical. Inside, her older mechanisms had started waking one by one. 2 exits if the curtain track did not jam. Blind corner near the cabinet. A reflective monitor screen angled just enough to show movement behind her if she needed it. She adjusted the overhead lamp by inches. Moved the sharps container farther from the bedside. Shifted a stool out of the direct approach path. Nothing obvious. Nothing random. Sophie came in tying her gown. You get very still when something feels wrong, she said. Mara checked the laryngoscope battery. That is one interpretation. Sophie studied her for half a beat, then let it go because the ambulance siren had reached the bay doors. The sound rose through rain, and concrete hit the loading entrance hard and cut out. Mara turned toward the hallway. Around her, the staff gathered into position, each carrying their own version of readiness. Cole with command written into every angle of his body. Sophie with nerves she hid behind task focus. Respiratory with quiet competence. Security with too much visible tension. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant plastic packaging and the metal edge of expectation. Mara pulled on gloves. Outside came the burst of voices that always preceded impact. Wheels moving fast. Paramedics calling out, doors opening. Then a raw, male shout tore through the corridor. Get your hands off me. Every muscle along Mara's spine tightened, not because of the volume, because she knew that voice without knowing the man. Not the person. The state. The exact pitch of somebody who was no longer seeing a hospital at all. The trauma doors burst inward, and the gurney came through. The gurney hit the brakes so hard the frame shuddered. Rain still shone on the paramedics' sleeves. One of them had both gloved hands clamped over the patient's right shoulder. Blood had soaked through twice already. The other was trying to push the report into the room before the room lost him. Male, early 30s. Gunshot trauma to right shoulder and left flank. Pressure dropped in transport. Pulled oxygen twice. Severe agitation. Possible concussion. Found near a disabled tactical unit off a service road near the port. Law enforcement is still sorting the scene. The man on the bed surged upright before the sentence was finished. He moved with the kind of violent force that makes everyone else in the room feel slow. One hand ripped free of the sheet. The other struck the monitor cable hard enough to send it skidding sideways across the mattress. A metal basin clipped the rail and clattered across the floor. Sophie flinched. Security tightened in the doorway. Cole stepped forward with his voice already sharpened for control. "Sir, lie back down." The soldier turned toward him with a look so immediate and feral it changed the temperature in the room. "Nobody touches me." He had blood on his neck, blood in the seams of his tactical shirt, blood drying black along one sleeve and still coming bright and wet through the other. His face was pale under the grime and rain, but his eyes were alive in the worst possible way. Wide, tracking, door, hands, ceiling, exit. Door again. Mara saw it all at once. Not defiance, not madness, threat saturation. Too many bodies in motion, too many unknown voices, too many people closing in without sequence. To a mind already convinced the perimeter had failed, the room would feel like an ambush wearing hospital light. A security officer shifted a half-step closer. That was enough. "Back off," Mara said. It was not loud, but there was a tone in it that cut through adrenaline better than shouting ever had. The officer stopped. Cole turned to her, already irritated. Mara stepped away from the bed. Daniel Vance did not know her name yet. His chest was heaving. He was trying to push himself farther upright despite the wound in his side. One of the paramedics reached to stabilize him and nearly caught an elbow across the mouth for it. "Do not touch me," Daniel snarled. Mara took one step forward and a no more. The exact distance mattered. Not close enough to crowd. Not centered like a challenge. Slightly offline so he could see the exit the room and her without feeling trapped between them. She kept both hands visible. "Sergeant." He did not answer. His eyes flicked over her face and away again. Her navy scrubs did not register as safety. Nothing did. Cole was still trying to force the room back into the shape he understood. "He needs to be restrained if he cannot cooperate," Nomara said. Cole's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me. He is not refusing treatment," she said, never taking her eyes off Daniel. "He is refusing threat." The room went tight around the sentence. Sophie looked from one to the other. Respiratory held still with the bag valve mask in both hands. The paramedics, who had spent enough time in bad calls to know when someone else understood the patient better than they did, stopped trying to muscle the situation back toward normal. Daniel's breathing turned harsher. His gaze snagged on the sharps container too close to the bed, then on the officer at the door, then on Cole's white coat. Mara reached sideways without looking, and slid the sharps container farther back along the counter. Daniel saw that. Only a flick of the eyes, only a fraction. But it told her he was still reading the room. That was enough. She lowered her voice. "Raven 6 verified. Black root, no extract." The change in him was instant. Not calm. Not relief. Recognition so deep it tore straight through the panic and hit something buried under blood loss fury and survival instinct. His whole body went rigid. The fight did not disappear. It broke pattern. His mouth parted. For 1 second he looked less like a man in a hospital and more like somebody who had just heard the dead answer back. "That code is dead," he said. Mara held his eyes. So are most of the men who knew it. No one else in the room moved. Even the monitors seemed suddenly too loud. Daniel stared at her. His shoulders were still locked. Pain had turned his face gray at the edges, but something in the way he looked at her had changed. He was not scanning for threat now. He was trying to place the impossible. He swallowed once. It looked painful. "That root was burned." "Yes. Who are you?" "The one keeping you alive," Mara said. "Lie back." For a suspended second, it was not clear which instinct would win. The one that had dragged him into the room fighting, or the one that had frozen him in place at the sound of a code phrase no civilian nurse should have known. Then the strength went out of his left arm first. Not all at once. Just enough that he sat back against the raised bed instead of lunging off it. Enough that the paramedic on his right could finally ease pressure without getting hit. Enough that Sophie's breath left her in a soundless rush. Cole recovered first. Good, he said quickly as if the room had not just split open in front of him. Now let us work. We need him flat. 2 units uncrossed. Full trauma panel. Move. Daniel's eyes never left Mara. Only her. Cole stared. That is not how this works. Daniel turned his head just enough to look at him, and the look in his face made the point before the words did. I said only her. Pain bent the last word out of shape. He still meant it. Cole's jaw tightened. You are in a civilian trauma center, Staff Sergeant. You do not dictate personnel assignments. Mara did not look at him. He will bolt if you crowd him, she said. And if he bolts right now, he will tear open the flank wound. Cole was furious at the fact of being right less than the fact of hearing it from her in front of everyone else. Mara could feel it. So could Sophie. So could the paramedics who had gotten remarkably interested in not taking sides out loud. Daniel shifted and sucked in a sharp breath. The sheet darkened again at his side. That settled it. Mara moved. Sophie light on my left. Pressure bags ready. Dr. Cole. I need blood hanging now, and I need the room cleared to essential bodies. The words came out clean and fast. No ceremony, just sequence. Sophie obeyed before she remembered to look at Cole. Cole saw it happen, hated it, then looked at the blood spreading under Daniel's flank and hated the alternative more. Do it, he snapped. The bed rose with a hydraulic click. Mara cut away the torn tactical shirt in swift, practiced strokes. Wet fabric peeled back from skin slick with rain and blood. The shoulder wound came first into view, ragged and ugly, but not yet catastrophic. The flank wound was worse, deep, contaminated. The kind of injury that could look survivable for 10 minutes and then turn the room into a funeral if anyone got careless. Daniel's hand came off the mattress in a searching motion, not to stop her, to find something that was not there. Weapon, teammate, rail, control. It was impossible to say which. Mara saw it without lifting her eyes from the wound. She put her free hand down over his wrist. Here. His fingers closed around her forearm hard enough to bruise and then loosened. She irrigated the shoulder first. Diluted blood and rainwater ran down the side of the mattress and dripped to the floor. Sophie held the light, steady eyes narrowed, trying to keep up with the order of Mara's movements. Not rushed, not hesitant, exact. Pressure where it mattered. Clean field where she could get one. Then down to the flank where the damage was more treacherous than dramatic. Daniel hissed through his teeth. You can yell, Sophie said before she could stop herself. He gave a breath that might have been half laugh and half pain, trying not to. Mara anchored a dressing and checked the seep. Keep trying. Cole was at the opposite side of the bed, hanging blood now with clipped, efficient anger. At his best, he was what he had always been in a crisis, useful once his ego found a task to attach itself to. He called out pressure. Respiratory got a cleaner sat reading. Sophie anticipated the next instrument more quickly each time Mara asked for one. For a few minutes the room found rhythm, the kind built under pressure and held together by focus. Then a burst of static crackled from the shoulder radio of the security officer in the doorway. A police dispatcher's voice spilled thin and urgent into the room. Something about a possible shots fired call near the Port District. Something about units still searching an industrial road. It was too broken to form a full picture, but the words hit Daniel like live wire. Every muscle in him jumped. His eyes left the room. The monitor climbed. Daniel. Mara's voice sharpened by a fraction. Stay here. He was gone somewhere else already. Not unconscious. Worse. Present enough to fight and absent enough not to know who he was fighting. They found the route, he rasped. Daniel. She put a blood-streaked hand flat against the rail where he could see it. Harbor Ridge. Tacoma. Trauma 2. White wall at your right shoulder. Ceiling vent above you. Sophie on your left. My hand here. Tell me what you see. His breathing was high in his chest. Clock. Good. Cabinet. Good. Door. That is enough. His eyes found hers again by inches. The monitor eased, not much, but enough to keep him from tipping over the edge. Cole had heard every word. So had Sophie. So had the security officer. None of them said anything about the dead code now. The room had moved past disbelief and into the far more unstable territory beyond it. As Mara cut away the last of the soaked fabric from Daniel's shoulder, his gaze dropped to the side of her neck, where the scrub collar had shifted during the struggle. He saw the faint white line hidden there beneath the edge of her hairline. His stare sharpened. That scar. Mara did not pause, hold still. His breathing changed again this time, not from panic, but from certainty. You were not support. Sophie looked up. What? Lower, Mara said without looking away from the wound. Sophie lowered the light. Daniel kept staring at Mara like the structure of the night was rearranging itself in front of him. You were with them. Cole looked from one to the other, irritation giving way to suspicion. With who? Daniel answered without taking his eyes off Mara. Raven 6. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Sophie frowned, as though she was trying to decide whether she had heard correctly. Cole's face went blank in that particular way people do when they realize there is a conversation happening around them in a language they do not speak and do not like being excluded from. Before anyone could push further, the trauma bay doors opened again. Not slammed. Opened with hard, controlled force by people who were used to entering rooms that surrendered on sight. A man in Army service uniform stepped in first, rain darkening the shoulders of his jacket. He was in his 40s, polished in the way of people who spent more time in briefing rooms than mud, but still carried enough field experience not to look decorative. 2 military police officers came behind him. A civilian in a dark overcoat followed last face, smooth and unreadable. The officer produced credentials before anyone asked. Captain Owen Pike, he said. We are here to assume immediate custody of Staff Sergeant Daniel Vance. The whole room changed temperature. Cole blinked once, then stepped into the opening with the instinctive authority of a physician reclaiming official ground. He is an active trauma patient. He is not stable for movement. Pike's eyes went to the monitor, the blood, the open suture packs, and then to Daniel. That assessment can be revisited after transfer. Daniel made a sound that was half laugh, half pain. Number. Pike ignored him. This matter falls under military jurisdiction. Mara straightened from the bedside. He is still bleeding. Pike looked at her for the first time as if noticing a piece of equipment had started giving opinions. And you are Nurse Bennett. Then you can give report to the transport medic. Mara peeled off one bloodied glove and pointed to the darkening line at Daniel's flank. He is hypotensive compensating and not cleared for transport. If you move him now, you risk reopening the wound. The civilian behind Pike shifted impatiently. This is a federal matter. This is a trauma bay, Mara said. Cole lifted both hands, trying to lower a temperature he had not controlled in at least 10 minutes. Captain, I am the attending physician. The patient requires further stabilization before any transfer can be discussed. Pike kept his eyes on Mara, not Cole. Mara could feel him reading the room now more accurately than Cole wanted to admit. Daniel was barely holding himself inside the walls of the hospital, and only one person in the building had his trust. Daniel solved the ambiguity for him. If she is not the one touching me, he said hoarsely, nobody is. Pike's mouth tightened. The civilian spoke for the first time. His voice was dry and careful. The voice of a man used to telling other people what jurisdiction means. Staff Sergeant Vance is in possession of sensitive information relevant to an active federal inquiry. He will be remanded to proper custody. Daniel's face hardened with a hatred so focused it steadied him. Say it cleaner, he said. You want me off record before I can talk. Sophie looked at Cole. Cole looked at Pike. The monitor sounded suddenly much louder than it had a moment earlier. Mara moved half a step closer to the bed. What inquiry? The civilian's expression did not change. Need to know. I need to know whether my patient is in danger if he leaves this room, Mara said. Pike's patience thinned visibly. Nurse Bennett, your role here is medical support. My role here is keeping him alive. It was not a dramatic line. That was why it landed. The civilian's eyes flicked over Daniel again, measuring him not as a man, but as a problem with a pulse. Mara saw the calculation and disliked the shape of it instantly. Men who look at casualties like evidence have already failed the first test. Then, from just outside the room, another voice cut through. He is right not to go with them. Everyone turned. Walter Keene stood in the doorway in a hospital gown under an open cardigan, one hand braced against the frame for balance. Gray hair flattened on one side. Telemetry leads still stuck to his chest. He should have been back in observation waiting on repeat cardiac labs. Instead, he was staring straight at Mara. Security started toward him. Walter did not move. Pike's face hardened. "Sir, this area is restricted." Walter ignored him completely. He was looking at Mara's posture, the angle of her shoulders. The way she had placed herself between the bed and the doorway without ever making the move looked dramatic. The way she never gave the men at the door her back, even while keeping Daniel inside her line of vision. "That is not nurse posture," Walter said quietly. Cole frowned. "Mr. Keene, what are you talking about?" Walter came one step farther and eyes never leaving Mara. "I am talking about the difference between med staff and someone trained to work while half the room is screaming and somebody outside is still shooting." Silence pressed in around the words. Daniel pulled in a painful breath. "Tell them," he said to Mara. She did not look at him. "Save your oxygen." That code, Daniel said more forcefully. No civilian nurse knows that code. Pike cut in sharper now. "Enough. Staff Sergeant, you are compromised. You are not in any condition to determine appropriate custody." Daniel gave him a look full of blood loss and contempt. "I am in perfect condition to know who came to finish the job." That landed harder than the previous accusation had. Sophie went very still. Cole's expression changed in a way that said the situation had finally crossed the boundary where he could no longer pretend this was just a difficult transfer. Pike signaled one of the MPs forward. Everything after that moved fast enough that later half the room would disagree on the exact order. The MP reached for the gurney rail. Daniel recoiled violently. The monitor spiked. Sophie lunged to secure the IV line before it tore loose. Cole barked for everyone to stop moving. The security officer at the door put one hand near his radio. Walter muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse, and Mara stepped directly between the bed and the men reaching for it. She did not shout. She did not raise a hand. She just occupied the space. "No one touches this bed." Pike stared at her. "Stand aside." Mara held his gaze. "He is unstable. Stand aside." Daniel's breathing was climbing again. Another 10 seconds of this and his body would decide the room was gone for good. Mara could feel the edge approaching. So could Sophie, who had one hand hovering near the blood tubing and the other clenched around a wad of gauze. Cole said very carefully now, "Captain, if the patient decompensates because of premature movement, that decision becomes part of the medical record." The civilian let out a short, humorless breath. "You think charting frightens us." "No," Mara said. "I think accountability does." Pike took one slow step closer to her. It was the first time he had come near enough to see her clearly. The blood on her scrub sleeve, the old scar hidden near the base of her neck, the total absence of bluff in her expression. Something in his face changed. Not recognition exactly, more like the first twitch of it. "Who trained you?" he asked. Mara did not answer. Behind her, Daniel said through clenched teeth, "Do not let them take me." She gave the slightest nod without turning her head. Sophie saw it. So did Cole. The room had become a line. On one side, a wounded soldier with too much blood on the sheets and too much dangerous knowledge in his head. On the other, men whose urgency had the wrong shape. Between them, the quiet nurse everyone had overlooked for years. Rain lashed harder against the ambulance bay doors somewhere beyond the corridor. Daniel's grip whitened on the sheet. Mara could hear the change in his breathing and knew the next touch, the next wrong voice, the next bad decision could send him over again. Pike reached for her arm. His mistake was not the aggression. It was the assumption. Mara moved so fast that Sophie did not fully catch the mechanics of it. One instant, Pike's hand was coming toward her. The next, Mara had shifted just enough to take his wrist offline, redirect his balance, and leave him half a step farther from the bed than when he started. Nothing theatrical. Nothing anyone could honestly call an attack. Just a clean, efficient refusal practiced too many times to be accidental. The MPs reacted instantly. The security officer swore under his breath. Cole froze. Sophie took a full step back, staring. Mara released Pike at once. "Do not touch me again," she said. For the first time since entering the room, Pike looked less irritated than rattled. Walter Keene closed his eyes for one brief second, and when he opened them again, the blood had drained out of his face. "Dear God," he said softly. The movement had twisted Mara's scrub collar just enough that the overhead light caught ink near the line of her left collarbone. A black wing, a curved line beneath it. Old, deliberate, mostly hidden until now. Daniel saw it and went still in a new way, not from pain, from certainty. "Raven 6, he said. This time it was not a question. Mara reached up and adjusted the fabric back into place. "That unit is dead." Walter looked at her like he had seen a story walk in off a battlefield and put on scrubs. "No," he said. "It was buried." Pike turned on him. "You are speaking outside your knowledge." Walter's gaze never left Mara. "When I was stationed near Kandahar, medevac crews told stories. Most stories got bigger every time they were told. The real ones got quieter. The civilians' patience finally snapped. This is absurd." Daniel ignored him. "They called you ghosts," he said to Mara. "No patches, no paper trail. Black root exfil. Med cover after support went dark." Mara's expression did not change. Cole was watching her as if the woman he had worked beside for years had just stepped out from behind a one-way mirror, and he was still deciding whether to be stunned or ashamed. Pike recovered enough to harden again. Former military history does not alter current authority. "No," Mara said. "Medical necessity does." Then Daniel spoke, and every person in the room heard the shape of the night finally turn. "They swapped armor plates," he said. No one interrupted him. He kept his eyes on Pike while he talked, but his trust stayed fixed on Mara the way a man keeps one hand on the wall in smoke. Vehicle retrofits. Readiness checks signed clean. Composite panels missing where they should have been reinforced. A mechanic on my team died in a rollover that should have broken bones, not necks. I pulled the maintenance chain. Somebody altered records. Somebody got paid. Then my route got compromised. The civilian's face remained smooth, but it had gone empty in a way that meant alarm beneath control. Daniel laughed once. It hurt him. "And now you show up before I am even stitched shut." Pike's voice came out clipped and cold. "You are in shock." Daniel's stare sharpened. "Then why are you in such a hurry?" Before Pike could answer, the corridor outside filled with a different sound. Boots. Several sets. Fast, coordinated, heavy enough to send a faint tremor through the crash cart parked against the wall. Every head turned toward the hall. Not hospital movement. Not patrol movement. Purpose. The security officer touched his radio and then stopped when another voice cut over the channel from somewhere near the ambulance entrance hard and command sharp. "Clear the corridor. Special operations access." Sophie went pale. Pike swore under his breath. The civilian straightened, as if preparing to seize the narrative before someone else could. Too late. The hallway outside Trauma 2 was already filling with disciplined motion. Staff backed out of the lane on instinct. Orderlies flattened against walls. Someone at the station dropped a clipboard. Then, a team of black-clad soldiers rounded the corner and came straight for the room in a tight formation that belonged nowhere near a civilian hospital, and yet, suddenly, made perfect sense. At their center walked a man in his 40s with a weathered face and the hard-built stillness of someone who had spent years making terrible decisions and surviving them. His tactical jacket was dark with rain at the shoulders. His eyes swept the room, once taking in Daniel, the blood Pike, the MPS, the civilian Mara. Then he stopped. Everything in him changed. He came to attention with the clean, reflexive precision of emotion old enough to live in bone. And under fluorescent trauma lights with a bleeding soldier on the bed, and half the room still trying to catch up, Major Thomas Archer saluted Mara Bennett. "Ma'am." No one moved. Sophie's hand slipped on the medication vial she was holding. Cole caught it before it hit the floor. Walter stared openly now, no doubt left in him at all. Pike had gone pale beneath the strain in his face. The civilian looked as though the geometry of the room had collapsed. Daniel's eyes did not leave Mara. She did not salute back immediately. Her face had gone still in a way that suggested the word itself had struck somewhere deeper than the rest. Then she gave the smallest nod. "At ease, Major." Archer dropped the salute and stepped forward. From inside his jacket, he removed a sealed weatherproof packet and handed it to her. His voice was calm, but the room could hear the steel in it. Immediate protective medical custody authorization. 48 hours pending federal review. Verification confirmed on site. Pike found his voice first. It sounded thinner than before. That is impossible. Archer did not look at him, read slower. Mara slit the packet with her thumb and scanned the first page. Rain ticked against the windows. Somewhere far off in the hospital, a child started crying and was quickly hushed. Life kept moving in distant rooms while Trauma 2 stood inside a different kind of time. When she finished reading, Mara folded the document once. Then she handed it to Cole. For the record, she said the patient stays. Treatment continues. Anyone interfering gets named. Cole took the pages carefully as if the paper itself had weight. Archer finally turned toward Pike and the civilian. You and your team will stand down surrender corridor access and await review. The civilian's voice came back cold. My office was not informed. Archer met his eyes. That is becoming a pattern tonight. Daniel let out a breath that almost turned into laughter and then into pain. Mara stepped back to the bedside, changed gloves, and checked the dressing at his flank. The bleeding had not worsened during the confrontation. That counted as victory in the language she trusted most. Daniel was still watching her. I thought that unit was gone, he said quietly. Mara adjusted the blanket away from the wound line. It is. His eyes stayed on her face. Then why are you here? She met his gaze for one beat no more. Because you are. The room had gone quiet around them again, though this time it was not fear holding it still. It was recalculation. Sophie moved, first reaching for the reinforced dressing with hands steadier than the ones she had walked into the trauma bay with. Cole set the authorization down on the counter, and for once followed the right gravity without needing to be told twice. Archer stepped into the corridor to reposition his people. Pike and the civilian did not leave, but the fight had gone out of their footing. Walter Keene lowered himself onto the chair near the wall with the look of an old man who had just watched a ghost refuse to stay buried. Mara checked Daniel's line, his pressure, the tension in his jaw. Stay with me, she said. His eyes never left hers. I am trying. That is enough. Outside the room, boots moved into place, and the corridor changed owners without another word. Inside it, the blood still smelled like blood. The fluorescent lights were still harsh, and Daniel Vance was still alive, because the one person no one had read correctly had been standing in the room when he came through the doors. Mara took a clean breath, reached for fresh gauze, and set her hand lightly on the rail. Hold still, she said. And this time he did. He obeyed, and that obedience changed the room more than any order ever could. For the first time since Daniel Vance had come through the ambulance doors, the violence in his body was no longer setting the pace. Pain still owned most of him. Shock still had its hands around his throat. But the part that had been braced to fight every stranger within arm's reach had found one fixed point and was holding there. Mara checked the pressure dressing at his shoulder, then the seal at his flank. Blood had slowed from a dangerous seep to something more measured. Not safe. Not yet. But measurable. In medicine, that mattered. What can be measured can be fought. What can be fought can sometimes be survived. Around her, everyone else was still catching up. Sophie stood at the left side of the bed with a suture packet in one hand and disbelief still crossing her face in quiet waves. The resident who had spent months studying under Dr. Ethan Cole and years believing hospitals ran on titles had just watched a major in a rain-soaked tactical jacket come to attention and salute the quiet night nurse from Harbor Ridge. Cole himself looked as though somebody had opened a second room inside the first one and forced him to admit he had never noticed the door. He had the authorization packet in his hand, eyes moving over the printed language again, with the concentration of a man who understood words were now the only solid ground left to him. Captain Owen Pike did not seem to know whether he was angrier at being challenged, outmaneuvered, or made to stand still in front of witnesses. The polished civilian beside him had gone pale in the expressionless way bureaucrats do when they realize procedure has stopped protecting them. Mara did not waste attention on any of that longer than she had to. Daniel's breathing was beginning to change. The adrenaline spike that had held him upright through fury and blood loss was draining. That was always the dangerous turn. When fear leaves, the damage finally gets a clean shot. Daniel, his eyes dragged back to her. You stay with me now." He gave the faintest nod. Mara held pressure a second longer, then looked up at Sophie. Reinforce the outer dressing, not tight enough to choke the tissue. Sophie blinked once like she was surfacing. Right. She moved in, and this time she moved differently. Still young, still learning, but no longer bringing the assumption that medicine was just force plus speed. Mara saw her hesitate before touching Daniel's side. "I'm going to place a new layer over the old one," Sophie said. "You'll feel pressure." Daniel's jaw tightened. Fine. The problem vanished before it formed. Sophie noticed that. Mara noticed her noticing it. Cole lowered the packet at last. "This is valid," he said quietly. It should not have needed saying, but the sentence mattered because he was saying it out loud in his own room. Where everyone could hear, he had accepted a structure he had not created. Pike took a step forward. Archer's team shifted in the corridor as one organism, not dramatic, just present. The nearest soldier did not touch a weapon. He did not need to. Competence has its own silhouette. "This is an overreach," Pike said. Archer finally turned to him fully. His voice was not loud. "No, it is late." The words landed with ugly accuracy. The civilian found his composure first. Men like him usually did. Their entire profession depended on being able to reassemble a face faster than other people reassembled trust. "My office has statutory authority, in any case, involving protected procurement channels and possible compromise of military evidence." Archer looked at him the way one might look at an instrument that had become less useful mid-procedure. "And my authority, at this moment, extends to the protection of a wounded witness inside a civilian trauma center, while a federal review catches up to reality. He is not merely a witness." "No," Archer said. "He is also unstable bleeding and under the care of medical staff who are no longer being treated as optional." The civilian's eyes flicked to Mara when he heard that last line. That was the first moment he truly saw her. Not the scrubs, not the hospital badge. The stillness under them. The old discipline. The fact that she had taken over the temperature of the room without once raising her voice. Daniel made a sound through his teeth. Mara looked down immediately. His skin had gone grayer beneath the grime. Pressure. Cole was already reading the monitor. Dropping again. Mara did not need him to tell her. She could see it in Daniel's mouth and the way his shoulders were trying to lock against pain and failing. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to his wrist, then shifted the dressing at the flank just enough to assess the seep, not enough to explain the drop. Cole was beside her now, attention where it belonged. "You think internal. I think we stop arguing and keep him from crashing." Cole nodded before he remembered Pride might have something to say about it. "Agreed. Additional blood. Repeat ultrasound. Lane, prep for reassessment." Sophie moved. Archer stepped back from the threshold, but did not leave. Pike and the civilian stayed where they were held in place by the fact that every attempt to seize control had only proven they did not understand what kind of room they were standing in. Walter Keene watched from the chair by the wall, one hand over the chest leads still stuck to his skin, as if the years had rolled backward under fluorescent light, and he had found himself once again in a place where young men bled while other men argued about jurisdiction. Mara leaned down until Daniel's line of sight narrowed to her. "Listen carefully. Your pressure dipped. I'm going to check the belly again. Cole is staying on the opposite side. Sophie is on your left. No one else touches you." Daniel swallowed. "Thought I was done taking orders? You can complain when you are less perforated." A faint sound escaped him, almost a laugh, too tired to fully become one. "Still here," he muttered. "Yes." The portable ultrasound came in. Cole took it this time without trying to reclaim the room through posture. He looked at Mara, once an unspoken question in it, less about authority now than rhythm. She gave him the smallest nod. He placed the probe with more care than he might have an hour earlier and announced the contact before he made it. Daniel still tensed, but he did not fight. They worked in silence for a moment. Gel pressured the black-gray bloom of the screen. Cole's face changed first. Free fluid. Not enough for certainty, enough for concern. Mara did not look away from Daniel. Can he tolerate imaging? Cole calculated. If he holds this next unit and the pressure stabilizes. Archer heard it from the doorway. He moves nowhere without sealed corridor control. That can be arranged, Cole said. Pike made a low sound of disbelief. Are we really pretending this hospital has suddenly become a secure facility? No, Mara said. We are acknowledging that your presence turned it into a risk. Pike looked at her with a kind of contained hatred that had not yet decided whether to become open hostility. It had the shape of a man used to being deferred to by people he considered softer than himself. The problem with that habit is that it collapses quickly when faced with someone who has survived things rank cannot intimidate. He stepped closer to the bed again, this time stopping short of the rail. Staff Sergeant Vance, you have served with distinction. You know how chain of command works. You also know panic and blood loss can distort judgment. You need to come with us before this becomes more complicated than it already is. Daniel turned his head slowly. The effort alone looked painful. His voice came out rough but steadier than before. I know exactly how chain of command works. Pike waited. Daniel's stare sharpened into something cold enough to frost steel. That is why I know when it has been sold. Silence again, the ugly kind. The civilian broke it with a controlled exhale. This conversation is no longer constructive. It was never a conversation, Walter said from the wall. It was an attempted extraction with polite language. Pike rounded on him. Sir, remain silent. Walter looked back with open contempt. I wore this country's uniform before you had enough years on you to shave without supervision. If you want me silent, do better than that. Archer's mouth did not quite move, but Mara caught the faintest shift there. Respect recognizes itself quickly. Cole glanced from Walter to Mara, then back to the screen in his hand, and something in his face rearranged. He was a trauma doctor. He understood sudden reversals. He understood when an unseen bleed changed the whole procedure. Human beings were harder for him than bodies, but he was not stupid. The evidence in front of him had become too overwhelming to keep misfiling. He looked at Mara as if seeing every previous year beside her in the department through a new lens. The calm in mass casualty scenes, the way she found hidden injuries, the refusal to sit with her back to doors, the complete absence of flinch when armed men entered the room, the way she had physically redirected Pike with clean efficiency and no wasted motion. He had mistaken all of it for temperament. That recognition did not flatter Mara. It exhausted her in advance. Lane, Cole said quietly, still scanning, get surgery on standby. I want CT ready the second his pressure says yes. On it. Sophie moved toward the phone, then checked herself and looked back at Daniel. I'm stepping away for 10 seconds. My voice is still in the room. Daniel blinked at her, then at Mara. Mara said go. Sophie called. Efficient this time, no wasted language. Outside the room, Archer spoke low into a shoulder mic, issuing corridor instructions with clipped precision. The soldiers moved in the hall with enough discipline to almost disappear once they had taken position. The difference between them and Pike's team was impossible not to notice. One group was there to protect a living person. The other had arrived trying to control an outcome. Daniel's eyelids dipped and then lifted again. Mara knew that look. He was not resting. He was slipping. Stay with my voice. He focused on her with visible effort. You always talk like that. Like what? Like every word costs extra. Mara replaced the soaked gauze beneath his flank dressing with something cleaner. Pain makes people hate filler. Walter let out a breath that could almost have been amusement. Even Cole glanced up at that. There was movement near the threshold. A middle-aged hospital administrator in a dark blazer had reached the cordon and was attempting to understand why the emergency department suddenly looked like a federal crime scene. One of Archer's soldiers intercepted her with perfect courtesy and absolute refusal. She tried to spot an opening around him and found none. Harbor Ridge was still a hospital. Other patients still needed medication lab draws, clean linen reassurance. Phones still rang. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying. Somewhere else, a drunk man was arguing with registration about insurance. Life did not pause because one room had become the center of a storm. It never did. That was one of the reasons Mara trusted medicine more than institutions. The work goes on, bodies do not care about theater. Daniel shifted under her hand. The movement was small, but she felt the line of strain at once. Do not test the dressing. Not trying to. Then fail less noticeably. His mouth moved at one corner, another almost smile. Sophie heard it while returning to the bedside and looked startled to find humor alive anywhere in this room at all. CT is ready when he is, she said. Surgery is notified. Cole nodded. Archer re-entered enough to catch the update. The route is clean. Pike gave a short, disbelieving sound. This is extraordinary. No, Archer said. This is inconvenient for the wrong people. The civilian's patience finally cracked in earnest. You are all behaving as if rumor and a tattoo outrank active federal inquiry. Mara turned her head just enough to look at him. No. We are behaving as if a wounded man with evidence attached to him was nearly moved while unstable by people who have still not explained why speed mattered more than survival. The civilian said nothing. That silence was answer enough. Walter's gaze had not left Mara in several minutes, not staring exactly. Witnessing. The sort of look soldiers give only a handful of times in life when something long carried as story suddenly stands breathing in front of them. At last, he said, quieter now, I heard about one of yours. Mara did not encourage him. He continued anyway. Field hospital outside coast, years back. Convoy came in torn apart. Support had gone dark. Somebody said there was one medic still moving between trucks after everyone else had given up counting. She kept triaging with one arm burned and one ear gone half-deaf from the blast. Men came home because she decided they would. The room was still enough that even Daniel's monitor seemed indecently loud. Walter looked at the scar near the base of Mara's neck. They called her Blackwing. Mara changed her gloves. Stories get edited when men are frightened. Walter gave a faint, bitter nod. That they do. Sophie stared at Mara with the kind of wide, involuntary attention that comes when a human being you thought you understood acquires impossible depth in front of you. Mara felt it and disliked it immediately. Legends are a burden invented by other people. They make it harder to do ordinary work, and most real survival is built out of ordinary work done under intolerable circumstances. Daniel's voice interrupted the silence. You were there when support got pulled. It was not accusation. It was recognition testing itself out loud. Mara kept her attention on the dressing. Yes. How long did you wait? Cole looked up. Sophie stopped moving. Even Archer, still near the hall, went still enough that the answer began pulling on all of them before it was spoken. Mara folded the blood-soaked gauze inward and set it aside. Long enough to learn the code meant the mission mattered more than the team. Daniel closed his eyes once. When he opened them again, something in his fury had shifted. Not gone, sharpened. That vehicle tonight should have held, he said. The route was ugly, but not impossible. We had certified side panel upgrades. On paper, he gave a breath that hitched against pain. Rounds came through places they should not have come through. Mara met his gaze. How many with you? He took too long to answer. One dead at scene, one missing when I lost visual. Driver might have run the tree line. I do not know. The uncertainty in his voice struck harder than grief would have. Grief at least has shape. Uncertainty keeps gnawing. Archer stepped farther into the room. His face had changed. Less command now. More damage. Names can wait, Mara said before Daniel could force himself into it. Daniel looked at her. You think saying them makes it real. It does. And right now your pressure says no. He let out a slow breath and turned his face slightly toward the ceiling, still giving orders. Yes? Cole set the ultrasound aside. He needs imaging now if we are doing it. We have a window. Mara checked the pressure herself, then the line, then Daniel's pupils. The collapse had leveled for the moment. Not safe but movable if everything around him behaved. He goes with one voice, she said. No crowding. No one comes up on his blind side. He is told before every hand, every turn, every door. Cole nodded immediately. The speed of that agreement was new. I lead from the head. You stay on his right, lane on lines. Archer added, my team takes corridor front and rear. Pike's people stay out. Pike took one step as if to object, thought better of it, then turned the objection toward bureaucracy instead. You are creating exposure for yourself. Archer looked at him. That concern would carry more weight if you had arrived asking whether the patient was alive before asking whether he could be moved. Pike had no answer to that either. The civilian tried once more, "This has not ended." "No," Mara said. "It has simply been delayed until he can outlive it." That was the sentence that finally drove both Pike and the civilian back a pace. Not surrender exactly, more like the first acknowledgement that whatever script they had entered would no longer fit the people in front of them. Sophie secured the last line. Cole checked the blood. Mara lowered the side rail on Daniel's right and let him see each movement before it happened. "We are moving you to CT." Daniel's eyes flicked once toward the door and back. How many in the hall? Archer's team and hospital security. He looked toward Pike without moving his head. And him. "Yes." Daniel swallowed. "He does not come with us." "Number." Archer said confirmed. A sliver of tension left Daniel's shoulders. Not much, enough. They unlocked the bed. The first emotion almost triggered him anyway. The subtle change of weight under a wounded body can feel like falling if the nervous system is already overloaded. Daniel's hand shot toward the rail. Mara caught his forearm before he could jerk the flank wound loose. "Stay on me." He found her face. "White wall," she said. "My shoulder. Your right hand on the rail." One turn, and then straight corridor. He breathed through his teeth. Cole signaled the move. The bed rolled. Archer's team opened a lane through the hallway with silent precision. Staff flattened back with a mix of confusion and instinct. A unit clerk at the station watched them pass with her mouth slightly open. An orderly paused with fresh linen stacked in both arms. Somewhere down the corridor, an old woman in a wheelchair looked up from a blanket and then away again. Hospitals absorb extraordinary things without ceremony, because there is always another person vomiting in room 12 and another family getting bad news in room 8. That was mercy in its way. The transfer to CT was slow, deliberate, almost reverent in its control. Cole stayed at the head of the bed. Sophie kept the IVs untangled. Mara stayed where Daniel could track her whenever the ceiling lights began to feel too fast above him. Archer and 2 soldiers cleared intersections before the gurney reached them, turning ordinary hallways into sealed arteries of motion. At the imaging suite door, the CT tech started forward with the automatic confidence of someone used to handling patient positioning. Mara stopped him with one sentence. "Use words before hands." The tech blinked, then nodded. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to lock the bed. Then we'll transfer on 3. Daniel's jaw flexed. "Fine." The transfer went clean because the sentence existed. Inside the scanner room, the world narrowed to colder light machine hum and the sterile smell unique to radiology. Daniel's breathing shortened once when the table moved under him. Mara stepped into his sightline immediately. Ceiling panel, my voice. Same room, different machine. He held there. The scan took less time than the fear surrounding it. By the time they rolled him back toward Trauma 2, Cole had enough information to wear the face of a man counting complications in real time. There was internal bleeding, but not the kind demanding immediate open surgery if the pressure could be supported, and the team moved quickly enough. Possible intervention, close monitoring, narrow margins. The sort of medical middle ground that saves some people and fools others into dying later. Back in Trauma 2, the room felt smaller. Not because it had changed physically, because everything irrelevant had been burned off it. The gawking had stopped. The authority dispute had shifted to the hallway. Even Pike and the civilian were gone from the immediate threshold, though Mara could feel them still somewhere nearby, angry in a more administrative zip code. Daniel lay back against the raised bed, eyes half-open, skin gone waxy under the overheads. Cole reviewed the scan at the monitor while Sophie documented. Archer stayed in the hall with his people speaking into the shoulder mic in sparse, efficient bursts. Walter Keene had finally allowed a nurse to guide him back to a nearby observation chair, though he kept his line of sight on the trauma room, as if unwilling to let history close before he was sure it had stayed changed. Mara changed the outer dressing on Daniel's shoulder herself. His hand lifted once, searching again, and this time she let him catch the edge of her sleeve rather than her wrist. "Still here?" he asked, voice low and frayed. "Yes." He studied her face through exhaustion and medication and everything else trying to drag him under. "Did you know who I was when I came through the door?" "Number." "Then why say the code?" Mara adjusted the blanket away from the wound line. "Because your eyes said you were trapped somewhere nobody else in this room knew how to reach." He swallowed. The answer hit harder than flattery would have. Truth usually does. Cole stepped away from the scan display at last. He looked from Daniel to Mara, then to the dressing in her hands. "There is no current surgical trigger," he said. "We monitor closely, continue blood repeat assessment. Keep IR on standby if the bleed declares itself." Mara nodded once. Then Cole did something more difficult than issuing a plan. He stayed quiet. It took Sophie another minute to realize how strange that was for him. She finished charting and looked between them, recognition dawning in pieces. Not just that Mara had a past, not just that she had been underestimated, that half the language of the room had changed around her, and Cole for once was not trying to translate it back into hierarchy. Daniel's eyes were closing, not safe sleep, exhaustion trying the handle. Mara touched the rail. "You can sleep in short pieces, not all the way down yet." He opened one eye. "You say everything like a field manual, and you complain like a man who has enough blood pressure to be annoying. That is encouraging." That did it. Sophie laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised all of them, including her. Even Daniel's mouth shifted. The room softened by 1 degree. Outside, the rain kept striking the bay doors and high windows. The city of Tacoma went on being itself under wet, black streets and sodium lights. In another wing, babies were being born. In another, someone was dying of something slow and unavoidable. Here in Trauma 2, the balance had changed for reasons most of the hospital would never fully understand. Mara disposed of the bloody gauze, washed her hands, and came back to the bed. Daniel watched her do it with the fixed concentration of someone trying to decide whether reality had become less dangerous or merely stranger. "You're really here," he said. She looked at him. "I am." He let out a breath that sounded like it hurt in more places than the wounds could explain. The room held that silence for a moment. Not empty. Full. Then Archer reappeared at the threshold and met Mara's eyes. "The corridor is secure." She nodded. Cole said, "He will need step down once we get through the next hour." Mara looked down at Daniel again. His color was still poor, but the wild edge was gone from his face now. In its place was something harder to manage and far more human. Trust mixed with pain. Shock mixed with recognition. The beginning of questions that blood loss and morphine would not let him ask yet. She set a fresh roll of gauze on the tray and straightened. "Then we get through the next hour." And because nobody in the room needed the sentence explained, work resumed. When the next hour finally loosened its grip on the room, it did not do so all at once. Trauma did not release people cleanly. It let go by fractions. A blood pressure that stopped dropping. A dressing that held. A set of eyes that stayed in the room even when pain pulled at the edges. A physician who stopped trying to dominate the air and started listening to what it was already saying. Daniel Vance lay propped under hospital light with one arm wrapped in lines, one shoulder packed and sealed, and the hard-drawn look of a man whose body had spent every reserve it knew how to spend. The anger was still there. So was the fear. But both had retreated far enough that exhaustion could finally reach him. Mara checked his pupils one more time, read the line of his breathing, then looked at Sophie. "You have him for 5 minutes." Sophie blinked. "I do. You know the sequence. Watch his pressure. Do not let anyone start asking him questions while I am gone." Sophie glanced at Cole before she caught herself. The reflex embarrassed her. Cole saw that too. So did Mara. Habit was hard to kill, especially in rooms where hierarchy had been mistaken for gravity long enough to feel natural. Cole said, "He stays under medical control. No one interviews him." The sentence helped, though not for the reason he might once have believed. It mattered because he was finally using his authority in service of the room instead of as a substitute for understanding it. Mara stripped off her gloves and stepped into the corridor. The hall outside Trauma 2 no longer looked like Harbor Ridge. Not exactly. It still had the same polished tile, the same fluorescent spill, the same rolling carts and wall-mounted hand sanitizer and exhausted staff threading from bay to bay. But now those ordinary things existed inside a controlled perimeter of black tactical jackets, hospital security keeping a nervous distance, and administrative personnel stalled at the edges of a story they had not been invited to manage. Major Thomas Archer was waiting by the glass panel outside the medication room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years between them stood there first. He had aged the way field men age when they live long enough to rise into command. Not softly. The lines around his eyes and mouth had not come from laughter. They had come from wind-lack of sleep loss and the strain of carrying decisions that never left anyone clean. His hair had gone mostly iron at the temples. His shoulders were still straight. His eyes were the same, sharp, weathered, built for triage. He looked at Mara in blood-marked scrubs and a Harbor Ridge badge clipped to her pocket and gave the smallest shake of his head. "I did not expect to find you here." Mara leaned one hand against the cool counter edge. "That makes two of us." Rain ran down the far windows in silver threads. Somewhere behind them, a transport monitor beeped steadily as an orderly rolled a patient toward imaging. Somewhere else, somebody laughed too loudly in the false bright way tired staff laugh when their nerves are still burning off an hour after the danger has passed. Archer watched her face carefully. When Daniel sent the code through the emergency relay central, thought it was delirium. He was delirious. And correct. Mara's mouth shifted by a degree that might have been humor in a kinder room. That happens. Archer let the answer stand. He had always known when not to crowd silence. That was one of the reasons he had lasted. Not because he was gentle, because he understood pressure. "We were told you wanted no contact," he said at last. "I did. We honored that." Mara turned her head and looked at him fully then. "You honored it because I was easier to protect off paper." He did not flinch. "Yes, that is not the same thing." Number. The honesty of it took some of the sting out of her anger and none of the shape. She looked through the glass into the medication room where sealed syringes sat in locked bins under white light, each one labeled "each one accounted for." Hospitals loved accountability because bodies demanded it. You gave a dose or you did not. You charted the time or you failed to. In that way, medicine was cleaner than the world she had left. Archer lowered his voice. The team that came for him was not supposed to move before legal review. And yet, we intercepted the signal late. Mara looked past him toward the trauma room, where Sophie now stood at Daniel's bedside speaking in the measured, simple cadence Mara had used for years, without anyone noticing it was a discipline. "You intercepted it at all because he stayed alive long enough to make it here." Archer said nothing. That told her enough. She folded her arms, then unfolded them again, because the posture felt too much like armor, and she had never liked wearing anything that felt ceremonial around men who dealt in paperwork and consequences. How bad? Archer took a breath. Not for drama, for accuracy. Daniel pulled records after a mechanic on his team died in a rollover during a training transfer. The vehicle had passed inspection. On paper, it was current on retrofit requirements. Composite reinforcement where it needed it. Side panel upgrade. Mount correction. Internal restraints marked replaced. Mara looked at him, and in reality, Archer's jaw moved once. Cheap steel where composite should have been. Missing brackets. Reinforcement signed off but never installed. Procurement chain routed through civilian fronts and former officers who should not have still had hands on anything. Mara closed her eyes for one heartbeat. Not because the facts shocked her, because they did not. How many knew? That is under review. That means more than one. Yes. The words sat between them like cold metal. In another room, another decade under different light, men had died the same way. Not always from bullets, sometimes from signatures, missing pieces, approved substitutions. Weight not where it should have been. Armor that existed only in briefings. The cleanest murders in the world are the ones buried under procurement language. Archer watched her absorb it. He knew better than to dress the truth for her. She would have hated him for that. Daniel copied enough to build a chain, he said. Names, dates, maintenance logs, altered compliance records. Whoever compromised his route moved before he could get the file package out clean. And Pike, tasked under the pretext of asset control. Mara let out a breath through her nose. Asset. Archer's eyes shifted once toward trauma 2. I know. No, she said quietly. You know the word. That is not the same as knowing what it does to a room like that. The correction landed. He took it. Outside, a helicopter passed low enough over Tacoma to make the glass hum in its frame. Neither of them looked up. They did not need to. Their bodies had already registered it. Archer spoke into the silence that followed. They reopened some sealed archive inventory after Daniel's relay triggered the old designations. Mara said nothing. He reached into an interior pocket and took out a narrow evidence sleeve. Inside it lay a small metal insignia dulled by time and dust. A dark bird with wings angled downward over a narrow blade. The number 6 worked subtly into the body if you knew how to look. Mara went completely still. I found it in a storage case with decommissioned files, Archer said. Yours was listed unrecovered. She looked at the insignia through the plastic. Cool under white light. Weightless from the outside. Heavy enough to split years open. I still have mine. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then he nodded. Then this one belonged to someone else. She knew before she asked. Who? Archer held her eyes when he answered. Ortiz. The hallway vanished for an instant. Not dramatically. Not in the way civilians imagine memory attacks. Nothing around her changed on the surface. The floor stayed under her feet. The fluorescent lights kept buzzing. Somewhere down the hall, a supply cart squeaked around a corner. But inside her, the world shifted by one old click. Ortiz, leaning against a truck tire in pre-dawn cold, grinning through busted lip skin because he had won $20 off a card game nobody had time to finish. Ortiz stuffing gauze in his vest pocket because he said medics only forgot things when they trusted the day. Ortiz disappearing into smoke where the radio had gone full of static and staying there too long. Mara took the evidence sleeve from Archer. The plastic was cool against her palm. I do not want condolences. You are not getting any. That almost made her laugh. It was why he had once been good in the field. He understood the difference between comfort and witness. One insulted the dead. The other simply acknowledged they had existed. She slid the sleeve into her scrub pocket. Archer studied her for a moment, then asked the question nobody else in the building would have been foolish enough to try. Why did you never come back? Mara looked past him into the corridor, where the ordinary machinery of a hospital still moved around the sealed lane. A transport aide waited with a wheelchair angled correctly outside another room. A nurse from telemetry was explaining a medication delay to a family with the patients born of having done the same conversation 100 times. Sophie, visible through the glass, adjusted Daniel's blanket and told him before touching his arm. The habits were spreading already, because that was what hospitals did with truth if they were lucky. They absorbed it into practice before anyone got the chance to turn it into a slogan. Because I got tired of bringing men home in pieces, while somebody in climate control called it acceptable loss, Mara said. Archer did not move. Because I watched equipment fail exactly the way paperwork promised it never would. Because I got tired of hearing the word sacrifice spoken by people who had never had to count bodies under emergency light. Because after enough years, survival starts to feel less like victory and more like participation. The muscles in Archer's jaw tightened, not in disagreement. In recognition. You were never responsible for all of it, Nomara said. But I was in the room. That was the thing no promotion package ever accounted for. Being in the room when the lie reached flesh. Being the one who had to hold pressure on the actual wound while somebody else chain-filed language over the cause. Behind them, the trauma room monitor alarm sounded once brief and mild. Mara was already turning before the tone finished. Go, Archer said. She was halfway back through the door before the word fully left him. Daniel looked up as soon as she entered. Not because the alarm mattered, because her absence had. There you are, he said. His voice was rougher now, frayed more by fatigue than pain. Sophie stepped back from the bedside. Pressure held. He tried to negotiate his own discharge. Daniel frowned. I was evaluating options. You are bleeding into hospital linen, Mara said. Your options are limited. That earned the first real smile Sophie had seen from him. Brief, dry, exhausted. It changed his face enough to reveal the man under the survival reflex. Mara checked the line dressing the skin around the tape. You good, Sophie asked quietly. Mara nodded once. Sophie did not ask where she had been or what had been said. Another thing she was learning. Cole entered a moment later with a tablet in one hand and the authorization packet tucked under his arm. He stopped inside the bay with a faint uncertainty that would have been unthinkable in him 2 hours earlier. The legal liaison wants the first preliminary statement as soon as he can tolerate it, he said. Daniel's face hardened on instinct. Number. Mara looked at him. No one is putting questions to you while your pressure is unstable. Daniel kept his gaze on hers. They will twist the gaps if I wait. Cole answered carefully. Then we make sure there are fewer gaps to work with. Daniel seemed almost startled by the fact that the doctor was speaking to him rather than around him. Mara adjusted the pulse ox clip. You will speak when your body can afford the truth. Not before. He held her eyes another second, then gave one tight nod. Cole stayed where he was. Mara could feel there was more behind the stillness. He had the look of a man approaching a sentence that cost him something. Bennett. She looked up. His eyes dropped once toward the blood-marked floor and then came back to her face. I owe you an apology. The room quieted. Even Sophie did not move. Cole took a breath. For tonight. For before tonight. For every time I mistook composure for limited range. For every time I treated the loudest person in the room as the natural center of it. For every time you saw what others missed, and I let the report simplify in my favor. His mouth tightened around the next part. I have been wrong about you for a long time. Daniel watched him with the exhausted alertness of a man who had seen enough failed leadership to know how rare useful correction really was. Mara set a hand lightly on the bed rail. You were wrong about more than me. Cole nodded at once. That, more than the apology itself, told her he had learned something real. A lesser man would have defended his intentions. A more vain one would have tried to redeem himself aloud. Cole simply took the hit where it belonged. I know. No theatrics, no absolution, just a clean line of truth. Sophie looked at Cole with a kind of startled respect that had not existed there an hour before. Not admiration, something firmer. The beginning of trust rebuilt on better footing. Daniel closed his eyes briefly against the light. Took bullets for the lesson, he muttered. Sophie bit back a laugh. Cole almost smiled in spite of himself. It left the room softer than before. The first preliminary interview did not happen until nearly 2 hours later, after another round of blood, another scan review, another reassessment of the flank wound, and enough medication timing to keep Daniel functional without tipping him into fog. Mara made sure of that herself. The legal liaison arrived with Archer just behind him, and a recorder sealed in a clear evidence pouch. The man introduced himself with federal calm, and the careful diction of someone who understood he had entered a room already hostile to procedural arrogance. Daniel took one look at the recorder and his shoulders started to lock. Mara stepped into his line of sight. Listen to me. His eyes moved to her. You answer what you can answer. You stop when I say stop. If you need a question repeated, you ask for it repeated. No one rushes you. The liaison nodded at once, understood. Daniel studied him, then Mara, then gave the smallest motion of assent. They kept the first statement narrow. Timeline, route assignment, vehicle designation, number of personnel, the failed panel, the moment rounds came through where they should not have. The fact that Daniel had previously copied maintenance and procurement records after an earlier death on the same equipment class. He spoke in clipped bursts, each one costing him visible effort. Sweat gathered near his hairline. His color thinned, but his mind stayed sharp. Mara watched more than his words. She watched the tightening around his eyes, the delay before his answers, the subtle flattening in his voice that meant his body was about to protect itself by going somewhere else. When the liaison started drifting into detail about file access logs and transfer pathways, Mara stopped him with one raised hand. That is enough for now. The man closed his mouth immediately. Daniel looked at her irritation and relief fighting in equal parts. I was still talking. You were fading. He knew she was right. That did not improve his mood. Feels familiar. What does being useful to people until the body gives out. The line hit harder than he may have intended. It hung there long enough for all three of them to hear what else it contained. Mara adjusted the blanket at his side. Then stop before that becomes the only language they understand. Archer, standing in the corner near the sink, lowered his gaze. The liaison packed the recorder without another word. After they left, Daniel watched Mara hang a fresh bag and check the tubing as if each movement might contain information he had not yet earned. You timed the meds, yes? So I would not be too fogged to testify. That should be standard. He looked at her a moment longer. It is not. No, Mara said, it is not. That silence was companionable in the way only certain exhausted silences can be. Not because peace had arrived. Because everybody in the room was too honest to fake it. As the night softened toward morning, Harbor Ridge began reassembling itself around the damage. Nurses changed shifts. Residents rotated out. Coffee appeared in paper cups with names half-written in marker. The environmental services crew mopped blood from tile that would look entirely ordinary by daylight. A child was discharged with 3 butterfly closures and a sticker. A cardiac patient got a bed upstairs. Someone in triage started crying in the quiet, exhausted way people cry when the body has decided for them. Inside Daniel's room, the hours stacked differently. At dawn, the city lifted from black to iron gray beyond the window. Rain thinned. The mountain line emerged far off in pale silhouette. Daniel slept in short bursts. Each time he surfaced, Mara anchored him before the room could tilt. Harbor Ridge, 4th floor now. He nodded. Window on your left. Chair by the wall. My voice. He nodded again. By late morning, he had enough strength to ask the question he had been carrying under everything else. Say it again. Mara looked up from the chart. What? The code. For the first time since the ER, something in her face shifted before she could flatten it. You know the code. I know the words. He swallowed. I want to know what they still mean when somebody who was there says them. Mara finished writing the last vital note, set the chart aside, and pulled the family chair a little closer to the bed. The room was plain in daylight. White board, recliner, sink, a tray with untouched gelatin and melted ice chips. The architecture of recovery has never been beautiful, only honest. She sat. Raven 6 verified. Black route, no extract. Daniel lay very still. What did it mean? Mara looked at her own hands for a moment. Most of the blood was long gone from them now, washed away by hospital soap and time, but the skin at the knuckles still looked older than the rest. It meant the objective was complete, she said. It meant all 6 of us were alive when the message went out. It also meant support had already been pulled. Daniel's eyes did not leave her. It meant command liked the outcome more than the people who earned it. The room held the sentence quietly. He asked the next question with none of the hunger people usually brought to military legends. No fascination in it. Only human cost. How many made it back? Mara's voice stayed level. 1. Daniel shut his eyes. Not because of the medication. Because the answer had landed where it lived. When he opened them again, some part of the reflexive distance between them was gone. That is why the phrase stopped me. Yes, it was not just authentication. Number. He looked toward the ceiling. The daylight there was thin and washed. It was grief. Mara nodded once. The word did not bruise her the way it once would have. It had been in her long enough to become structure. Daniel took a careful breath. My convoy last night felt wrong before the first shot. Tires too cheap for the route. Panel weighed off on the right side. Comms static where it should have been clean. We were told the vehicle had been upgraded after the last audit. Mara listened. When the rounds came through, I knew. Knew what? Daniel turned his head back toward her. That somebody had priced us for death. There was no answer soft enough to comfort that sentence and honest enough to keep. Mara did not try. Then keep breathing long enough to say it under oath. He gave the smallest nod. The next interviews came in stages across the day and into the evening. Never too long. Never without warning. Never after medication had blurred him past usefulness. Mara enforced that line with a clarity that made the liaison grateful and everyone else wise enough not to argue. Cole saw it all. He saw the effect of timing, the difference between questioning a witness and exploiting a patient. The way Daniel answered more clearly when he knew the room would not use his weakness against him. He saw Sophie watching too, taking in each small adjustment the way good physicians learn before they ever have the language to teach. Late that afternoon, Cole found Mara in the supply room where she was restocking suture packs she should not have been the one restocking after a night like this. He stood in the doorway a moment before speaking. She kept counting. I spoke to administration. That sounds exhausting. It was. A faint line of humor crossed her face and disappeared. Cole rested one hand on the shelf. I am putting together a formal response protocol for high agitation trauma patients. Combat stress dissociation. Panic psychosis. Any case where the room itself can turn the patient worse. Interdisciplinary. Security included. Mara set the box down and looked at him. He went on. You were right. We have been too willing to let titles outweigh observation. Nurses see things physicians miss because nurses are often the ones still in the room after everyone else has moved on. The admission sat awkwardly in his mouth, but it was clean. He was not performing humility, he was trying to practice it. I knew that in theory, he said. I did not build around it in practice, and now I intend to. Mara studied him in the flat, white light of the supply room. Somewhere outside, a printer rattled out labels at the station. The hospital kept breathing. If you do it because of me, it will fail, she said. Cole frowned. Why? Because right now I am unusual to you. A story, a correction with drama attached. Do it because the next frightened patient deserves a room that does not make him worse. Cole took that in slowly. Then that is why. She held his eyes another second, measuring whether the answer would last longer than his shame. Include transport. He blinked. Transport. Include housekeeping unit clerks, techs. The patient sees everyone. Anyone can escalate a room or steady it. Cole looked genuinely startled. Mara saw the realization land and did not soften it. Exactly. He let out one tired breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. You are rewriting my department one sentence at a time. No, she said, I am describing the one you already had. When she returned to Daniel's room, he was awake and looking out the window at the city under evening rain. Not much of Tacoma was visible from this angle. Parking structures, a strip of wet roadway, sodium light beginning to come alive in the dusk. Ordinary things. That seemed to comfort him more than anything dramatic could have. You look less like a battlefield, she said. He glanced over. And you look exactly the same. I do not know whether that is reassuring or unnerving. Take reassuring, it costs less. He gave a faint, tired smile. The folder on his tray table was thicker now. Statements, timelines, names, pieces of a system starting to understand it could no longer keep itself abstract. Briggs told me they tried to bury the old Raven files twice, he said. Mara adjusted the angle of his IV pump. I am not surprised. He also said there was once a recommendation package in your name. Return to service, restored rank, command track. She moved to the window and tilted the blind one notch against the glare from the lot below. I answered it. Daniel frowned. How? I did not go. He watched her for a long moment. The city reflected faintly in the glass behind her. If you went back now, they would give you more than rank. Mara turned from the window. I do not need more rank. What do you need? The question was unexpectedly gentle. For a second, she thought of the evidence sleeve in her pocket. Ortiz's insignia. The old washed cloth in her locker around her own. Sophie learning to lower her voice before entering a frightened room. Cole discovering a little too late and not too late at all that authority without listening is a brittle thing. The unhoused man who had finally let someone cut off his boots because she told him the truth first. The kinds of repair no uniform had ever known how to honor properly. She looked at Daniel and gave him the only answer she trusted. Peace, she said, and work honest enough not to lie to the dead. He closed his eyes once, then opened them again. I understand that. Mara believed him. She checked the chart, adjusted his blanket away from the healing line of his flank, and moved toward the door. Daniel's voice stopped her. Mara. She turned. When I came through those doors, I thought everyone in this place was either a threat or a wall. He swallowed. You were neither. Mara stood with one hand on the frame, the hall light behind her. No, she said, I was the nurse on duty. And because that was still the truest title she had, she left it there. That might have been where another kind of story would have ended, with the truth spoken softly in a hospital room, with the wounded soldier alive long enough to testify, with the hidden past named just enough to satisfy the people listening from outside it. But hospitals have their own way of refusing clean endings. They swallow extraordinary nights and turn them back into daylight work. Floors get mopped. Monitors get reset. Fresh sheets go on beds that held blood an hour earlier. Somebody from dietary forgets a spoon. Somebody from transport arrives at the wrong room and apologizes before hurrying off. The extraordinary gets absorbed not because it mattered less than it should have, but because there is always another patient whose pain does not know or care what history just walked through the hallway. By the next morning, Harbor Ridge had resumed its outward rhythm. Breakfast trays arrived with lukewarm eggs and coffee that smelled stronger than it tasted. Elevators opened and closed. Visitors argued softly over parking validation. A child came in with a split lip after running into a kitchen counter. An older woman arrived short of breath after trying to carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs because she did not want to ask her son for help again. A man in a dark suit insisted his chest pain was stress until the first troponin came back and made the room colder. The work did not pause for revelation. Still, something had shifted. Mara felt it first in the way people entered rooms. Security officers who had once bunched up in doorways now stopped themselves before crowding a frightened patient's line of sight. Residents started announcing themselves before reaching for a wrist or lifting a gown. 2 nurses from surgery found Mara at the station and asked with a care that would have sounded impossible a week earlier if she would show them how to keep a room from hardening around somebody in panic. Sophie had already begun changing the way she taught interns. On the second day after Daniel's arrival, Mara passed an open exam room and heard Sophie stopping a first-year resident halfway through a psych consult. "Slow down," Sophie said. The resident looked confused. "I'm being calm." "You are being quiet," Sophie corrected. "That is not the same thing. You are still moving like you think the patient is the problem. Start again." Mara did not step in. She kept walking, chart tucked under one arm, but the corner of her mouth shifted by a degree. Daniel stayed under close watch on the secure step-down floor with Archer's people managing the hall in a way that barely disturbed the rest of the hospital. That mattered. They did not perform protection. They simply did it. No loud posturing. No unnecessary contact. No men planted inside his room trying to claim air that belonged to medicine. Archer understood that once a patient starts reading a room as hostile, every body inside it becomes either ballast or danger. He had made sure his team knew the difference. Pike and the civilian investigator were not seen again at Daniel's door after the first night. That did not mean they were gone. It meant the fight had changed shape. Now it lived in sealed calls, legal reviews, names added to documents, names scrubbed from them. Oversight offices trying to determine which version of the truth would survive contact with bureaucracy. Mara wanted none of it. She cared only about the body in the bed and the fact that it remained alive long enough to keep speaking. Daniel improved in honest increments. By the 3rd day, he could sit upright without the room dimming at the edges. By the 4th, he could move to the chair by the window with assistance and enough irritation to prove his mind was returning faster than his patience. The shoulder still burned. The flank still punished every careless shift. But the raw combat glare was gone from his face. In its place was the drawn, dry weariness of a man emerging from shock and meeting the full cost of what remained. He had more humor than Mara expected. It sat low and bitter in him, the kind that survives where comfort does not. On one gray afternoon, she found him standing with one hand braced on the windowsill staring down at the wet city below. Tacoma spread out in muted steel and concrete roadways slick under rain. The port cranes standing motionless in the distance like enormous patient things that had seen everything and judged nothing. "You are not supposed to be impressing gravity today," Mara said. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. "I was testing whether this room gets smaller if I stand." "Does it?" "No, but the chair insults me less now." She came to his side and checked the color in his face. "Better. Not good enough to be careless, but better." He looked back out the window. "I used to think hospitals were the worst place to feel powerless." Mara adjusted the angle of his sling by a fraction. "Used to." He nodded toward the city below. "Now I think it depends on who is in the room. That is true of most places." He looked at her, one corner of his mouth moving. "That is close enough to agreement for you, right? You are healing. Do not ruin it by becoming observant." He laughed once, then winced hard enough that she immediately set a hand near his elbow. "Easy." "Yes, ma'am." The title still sat oddly on her when it came from him, less because of rank than because of what he meant by it now. Not hierarchy. Witness. Trust. The kind that cost something. Archer came and went in measured visits, never lingering, never filling silence because he knew silence well enough not to waste it. On the fourth evening, he found Mara in the medication room checking a pain schedule against Daniel's planned legal session. "You timed the doses again," he said. Mara did not look up, yes, so he would not have to choose between clarity and tolerable breathing. That should be standard. Archer leaned a shoulder against the wall just enough to suggest fatigue and not enough to imply comfort. "It is not. Number." He watched her a moment. He notices. Good. There was rain in the seams of his tactical jacket. The city had been wet for days. "The first sealed review is moving faster than expected," he said. "Several names attached to procurement and maintenance oversight are already under inquiry." Mara marked the next medication window on the chart, and the men who compromised the route, still being peeled back, which means they had help. Yes, she closed the chart. Corruption almost always travels with company. Archer's mouth shifted. "You have not changed." "I changed enough to leave." That ended the thought where it stood. Later that same evening, Cole found Mara in a conference room with a legal pad, 3 policy manuals, and enough stale coffee in paper cups to suggest he had been there a while. The whiteboard behind him was already filled with notes in black marker. Voice discipline. 1 lead speaker. Touch warning before contact. Control doorway density. Reduce crowding. Observe before intervention. Patient focus point. He looked up when she entered. "I was hoping you would come by." Mara stayed near the door. "That depends what you were hoping for." Correction. She stepped farther in and read the board. Some of it was useful. Some of it was the sort of language administrators love because it looks sturdy on paper and evaporates the first time a room gets loud. "You cannot teach calm as a script," she said. Cole set the marker down. "Then how do you teach it?" "You teach people to find the patient before they try to fix the problem." He frowned. "That sounds right and vague, because you are still hearing it like a physician." He almost smiled at that. "Help me hear it differently." Mara crossed to the board and drew a line through 3 of his bullets. "Less talking," she said. 1 voice if possible. 1 person touching if possible. Explain before contact. Make the room smaller, not bigger. Cole watched the marker in her hand. "You make it sound obvious. It is obvious. That is why people ignore it." She wrote 3 new lines beneath the rest. Name the room. Name the body. Name the next step. Cole read them twice. "Walk me through it. If the mind is somewhere else, bring it back to a place it can see." Name the room. White wall, open door. Chair by the sink. Then name the body so fear stops being the only thing speaking. Your breathing is fast. Your hand is shaking. You are safe enough to sit. Then name the next step so the patient has something to survive toward. I am going to check your pulse. I am going to place the line. I am going to leave after that. Cole nodded slowly, not because he had mastered it, but because he could already feel the framework under the words. "This is not sedation policy," he said. "Number. It is room control. It is patient stabilization," Mara said. The phrase sat there. Useful, accurate, clean. Cole uncapped another marker and wrote it at the top of the board in larger letters. Patient stabilization response. He looked back at her. Administration will ask where it came from. Then tell them the truth. That would require them to listen. Mara put the marker down, then start there. By the 5th day, Harbor Ridge had begun changing in ways too practical to be called symbolic. Transport staff were included in morning reviews for difficult cases. Housekeeping supervisors sat in on the first training session because Mara had insisted they often entered rooms when patients were most disoriented and least prepared. Unit clerks were told to watch hallway buildup near frightened patients and redirect traffic before it thickened into pressure. Security trained with nurses rather than beside them. Sophie ran the first simulation because Mara refused to. A young resident played a patient in withdrawal, and another played the lead nurse. The first attempt failed almost immediately. Too many voices, too much reassurance, not enough sequencing. The fake patient escalated right on schedule. Sophie stopped the exercise. "You are trying to overpower fear," she said. "That never works. Slow yourself down first." From the back of the room, Cole listened without interrupting. Mara stood near the wall with arms loosely folded, saying nothing unless somebody truly missed the point. Most of them did not. The room had already taught the lesson. Training was only catching language up to what people had seen. Afterward, an administrator in a dark blazer approached Mara at the station with a folder held too neatly in both hands. "We are planning a formal recognition event," she said. "Nothing excessive. Hospital leadership. A few board members, perhaps limited press if legal clears the boundaries. Your actions have become a source of pride for the institution." Mara did not look up from the medication reconciliation she was signing. "Number." The woman blinked. "I understand modesty, but this is really about honoring exceptional service. It can honor the work without putting me in a room for it." The administrator's smile tightened. "You have become something of a symbol here." Mara capped the pen and finally looked at her. "That is exactly the problem." At the next station over, Sophie made a sound into her coffee cup that was almost certainly a disguised laugh. Cole, reviewing charts nearby, kept his expression very carefully neutral. The administrator tried one final angle. It would mean a great deal to the board. Mara returned the chart to the rack. "Then they can improve staffing ratios." The woman left with her folder held a little closer to her chest than before. Sophie waited 3 seconds. "Staffing ratios." "I said what I said." Daniel's formal testimony began on the 6th day, not in a courtroom. Not yet. In a secure conference room on the same floor with legal oversight, a recorder, a chain of custody officer Archer at the wall, and Mara adjusting the timing of medication and rest like a conductor who refused to let the room cheat. Daniel walked there under his own power slowly, one hand briefly grazing the rail outside the room when the hallway narrowed too sharply around him. Mara stayed close enough to ground him if he needed it, and far enough not to make him feel escorted. The session lasted 43 minutes. He named equipment classes, maintenance report dates, substitution patterns, compliance signatures. He described the earlier rollover that had killed a mechanic on his team in a vehicle that should have protected him. He described the way the panel failed during the attack on his own road. He identified the point at which he had copied the procurement records and the likely moment the leak began moving back toward the people who had reason to silence him. When his breathing started to shorten and the right side of his jaw locked harder than the left, Mara stopped the interview. The lead counsel looked as if he might protest. Archer's expression alone solved that. Daniel sat back in the chair and shut his eyes. "Thought I had more in me," he said. "You had enough," Mara answered. He looked up at her. "You always know exactly when enough is." "No, I just pay attention before damage starts lying." That stayed with him. It stayed with Cole, too, who by then had taken to writing down certain things Mara said as if language itself had become part of the equipment he had previously neglected to stock. On Daniel's 7th day, the hospital changed shift under a clear sky for the first time since his arrival. The rain had finally broken. The windows looked sharper. The morning light over Tacoma came in cold and blue, clean enough to make the room seem briefly unfamiliar. Discharge planning began that afternoon. Mara checked the wound line at his flank and found it healing the way honest wounds heal. Slow, tight, unforgiving if handled badly. The shoulder would leave a scar. So would the rest of him. Some injuries never ask permission before staying. Daniel pulled a gray sweatshirt carefully over his head after the dressing change favoring the right side, but managing it without help. When he finished, he looked less like a patient and more like a man stepping back toward his own life under altered terms. A folder sat on the tray table beside him. Legal schedules, protective transfer notes, contact restrictions, the architecture of survival after the hospital. Mara closed the chart. "That is it." Daniel nodded, but did not move. She looked up. "What?" He let his eyes travel around the room once. The white board with the date. The chair by the wall. The cheap framed print nobody ever noticed. The monitor. The narrow sink. The place where his life had divided without asking permission. "I'm trying to leave this room like it's just a room," he said. Mara slid the chart into its carrier. That takes time. He looked at her. You always answer like that. Like what? No speeches, no grand line, just the thing itself. Most grand lines are for people who are leaving. He smiled faintly. Then maybe I learned something here. A quiet settled between them, not empty, not awkward. Full of everything neither one of them needed to say out loud. The door opened, and Archer stepped in, carrying a plain dark jacket over one arm. The vehicle's ready downstairs, he said. No media, no crowd. He gave Daniel the jacket, then looked at Mara. Take your time. When he stepped back out, the room grew still again. Daniel stood beside the bed, one hand on the rail more out of habit than need. Then he turned fully toward Mara and straightened as much as the healing shoulder allowed. It was not rigid, not ceremonial in the polished sense, but it was close. Then he lifted his hand in a formal salute. It was not for rank alone. It was for witness. For the exact moment, a stranger in Navy scrubs had spoken 6 dead words and given him a way back into the room before he tore the whole place apart, trying to survive it. Thank you, ma'am, he said, for not letting them move me, for seeing me before I had to become a problem. Mara held his gaze for one beat and gave the smallest nod. Go testify. That is the plan. Stay alive long enough to finish it. He almost smiled. I'll do better than try. That satisfied something in her face, though only barely. He hesitated at the door. Archer says they may make you an offer after this settles. Consulting, training, maybe more. Mara adjusted the cuff of her scrub sleeve. Archer says many things. You're still not going back. It was not really a question. Mara looked past him into the hallway where Sophie was coaching a new tech through the approach to an elderly dementia patient who kept panicking when people blocked the window. The wheelchair was angled correctly. The door remained clear. The voices were lower than they had once been. Small things, ordinary things. Done better than before. No, Mara said. Daniel followed her gaze. He understood enough not to press further. When he stepped into the corridor, the floor gathered around him without crowding. Sophie lifted a hand from the station. Cole gave him a nod that carried more respect than he would once have thought to show a patient. 2 nurses from nights paused in their charting long enough to wish him luck. Daniel answered each of them by name because the room had taught him that people hold together better when they are seen specifically. At the elevator bank, Archer waited. Daniel turned once before stepping in. Mara was still at the station chart in hand, scrub top wrinkled at one shoulder, a loose strand of hair fallen near her temple after too many hours under white light. Not a legend, not a ghost, a nurse on shift. He gave her one last nod. She returned it. Then the elevator doors closed. By mid-afternoon, the floor had settled into a quieter kind of normal. Mara checked on 3 post-operative patients, talked a teenager through an anxiety spike before imaging, and corrected a resident who kept standing between a frightened child and the mother he was reaching for. The work did not care what had happened last week. The work simply arrived and demanded honesty. That was one of the reasons she trusted it. Near the end of shift, she opened her locker and found a folded note tucked beside the spare socks and the washcloth wrapped around her old insignia. The handwriting was Daniel's plain block letters pressed hard into the paper. You saved my life twice. I won't waste either one. Mara read it once. Then she folded it back on the same crease and placed it beside the evidence sleeve Archer had given her, where Ortiz's insignia lay cool and silent under plastic. For a moment, her fingers rested on the locker shelf. Then she shut the door. Her break came after dark. The hospital roof was colder than she expected. Wind moved across the helipad with a dry, clean edge that carried mountain air into the city. From up there, Tacoma looked less like a port and more like a scatter of light laid carefully against black water and deeper dark. Ambulances came and went below in intervals of red. The hum of the building rose through the structure, softened by distance into something almost peaceful. Mara stepped to the rail and let the cold work on the heat still trapped in her skin from the shift. The rooftop door opened behind her. You're becoming predictable, Doctor. Cole came to stand beside her coat collar turned up against the wind, a folder tucked under one arm. That is probably good for patient safety, he said. She looked at the folder. What now? He handed it over. The first page was clean and simple. Patient stabilization response. Below the title in smaller print, the opening line read, "The patient is the mission. Every person in the room is part of the outcome." Mara looked at it, then at him. "That was yours," he said. "No, that was the room." Cole accepted the correction with the ease of a man who had finally learned that not every true thing needed his name near it. Below them, the city kept breathing. Cars moved through wet intersections. Somewhere, a siren rose and fell. Somewhere else, a family was hearing bad news in a room with too many chairs and not enough words. A deep, mechanical pulse entered the air from the west. Rotor wash, old enough in Mara's body to arrive before thought. Her shoulders went still. Cole heard the aircraft a beat later and turned toward the sound. A military helicopter crossed low over the city, black against black, until the navigation lights caught and traced the shape of it. It did not turn toward the hospital. It did not circle. It passed above the skyline in a smooth, deliberate line and gave one subtle bank in acknowledgement before leveling again toward the mountains. Cole looked from the aircraft to Mara and understood, in the incomplete way civilians always would, that some conversations happen entirely in gestures the official record never touches. Mara lifted one hand and touched two fingers lightly to her chest. Nothing ceremonial, nothing for anyone else. Just recognition answered with recognition. When the helicopter was gone and the sound had thinned into distance, Cole let the silence stand a while before speaking. "What is the first rule," he asked, "if I have to boil all of this down into one line?" Mara looked through the rooftop glass toward the lit floors below, where nurses and aides and residents and clerks and transport staff and housekeepers and patients all kept the building alive in their separate ordinary ways. "Treat the room before the room treats the patient," she said. Cole nodded slowly. She handed the folder back. "And teach them that every role counts when someone is frightened enough to stop hearing words." He held the folder against his coat in the wind and said nothing more. He did not need to. Below them, another ambulance backed into the bay. The work was still there. Always. Mara opened the rooftop door and stepped back into the warmth and fluorescent hum of Harbor Ridge. She walked past the conference room where the new protocol would be taught. Past the station where Sophie was signing off a handoff note. Past a resident lowering his own voice before entering a room because he had finally learned that volume and control were not the same thing. At the station, Sophie looked up. "We have a new admit in 4. Severe anxiety, refusing labs." Mara set down her coffee. "Has anyone explained the draw before reaching for him?" Sophie shook her head. "Not well." Mara took the chart from her hand. "Come with me." They walked down the corridor together. Not fast, not slow. The pace that leaves room for fear to breathe without giving it the whole hallway. At the door, Mara paused just long enough to read the room. The light, the body on the bed, the exits, the hands, the angle of the chair. Then she stepped inside. The patient was young. Frightened in the way some frightened people become angry because anger feels less humiliating. His pulse showed in his throat. His fists were closed too tightly over the blanket. A tech stood too near the bedside with a tray that looked like a threat because no one had yet bothered to translate it into anything human. Mara held out one hand. The tech stepped back. The room got smaller and safer by inches. Mara met the patient's eyes. "My name is Mara," she said. "You are safe right now. I'll tell you each step before it happens." The young man stared at her, still breathing too fast, still braced against whatever the day had taught him to expect from strangers. Mara stayed where she was. No false smile, no hurry. Sophie watched from just behind her shoulder, learning again. Outside, the station kept moving. Phones rang. Wheels rolled. Somebody asked for transport. Somebody else laughed. The building held. Inside room 4, Mara gave the patient one steady thing after another until the room belonged to him again. And because that was still the truest work she knew how to do, and because it was enough, she stayed.